The arrival of the autumn rain of 1916 turned the Western Front into a sprawling graveyard of mud and despair. Captain James Whitmore stepped off a supply truck into ankle-deep sludge, his medical bag clutched against his chest like a talisman against the chaos that surrounded him. The field hospital at Passchendaele was nothing like the sterile teaching rooms of Edinburgh Medical School, where he had trained. Here, canvas tents sagged under the weight of rain and misery, and the air thick with the metallic scent of blood mixed with antiseptic and decay. Major Davidson, the senior medical officer, barely glanced up from his paperwork when Whitmore reported for duty. "Another doctor," he muttered, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "Good. We lost 3 last week to the shelling. You'll be in Tent C, handling the overflow. Try to keep them comfortable until they die, or until we can get them to the rear hospitals." Whitmore had expected hardship, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer scale of suffering. Rows upon rows of wounded men lay on stretchers, their bandages stained brown and black, their faces contorted in agony. The nurses moved between them like ghosts, their eyes hollow from sleeplessness and grief. What struck him most forcefully was not the wounds themselves, but the infections that followed. Men who survived artillery shells and machine gun fire died days later from gangrene, sepsis, and mysterious fevers that no amount of morphine could touch that on his 3rd day. Whitmore made an observation that would change everything. He noticed that the mortality rate varied dramatically between different sections of the hospital. The men in the eastern tents, closer to latrines and supply depot, died at nearly twice the rate of those in the western sections. When he mentioned this to Davidson, the major dismissed him with a wave of his hand. "We're in the middle of a war, Whitmore. Men die. That's what happens here. Your job is to ease their passing, not to play detective." But Whitmore couldn't let it go. He had read the works of Florence Nightingale and the emerging theories about disease transmission. What if location mattered? What if something in the environment itself was killing these men faster than their wounds? He began keeping meticulous notes, tracking every patient's position in the hospital, the nature of their wounds, and the progression of their infections. His colleagues thought him odd, this quiet Scottish doctor who spent his evenings scribbling in notebooks by candlelight instead of drinking away the horrors of the day like everyone else. The orderlies called him the accountant behind his back, and the other doctors largely ignored his theories about environmental factors and invisible contagion. Then, in November, disaster struck. A supply convoy was destroyed by German artillery, and the field hospital's medical stores went up in flames. Morphine, chloroform, bandages, antiseptics. Everything burned. A runner was sent to request emergency supplies from headquarters, but it would take weeks for new shipments to arrive. The autumn offensive was consuming resources faster than the supply lines could replenish them. Major Davidson called an emergency meeting of the medical staff. His face was gray, his hands trembling slightly as he addressed them. "Gentlemen, we have enough morphine for perhaps 3 days if we ration strictly. Our antiseptic supplies are nearly exhausted. Bandages we can improvise, but without medicines we cannot treat infections, we cannot perform surgeries, and we cannot ease suffering. I'm ordering a halt to all but the most critical procedures. We'll do what we can, but I fear we're about to lose a great many men." The meeting ended in stunned silence. Whitmore returned to his tent, his mind racing. Without medicines, conventional medical practice was impossible. But what if convention was part problem? What if there was another way? He pulled out his notebooks and began to read through his observations, searching for patterns, for anything that might offer hope in this darkest of hours. As dawn broke over the muddy battlefield, Captain James Whitmore made a decision that would either save thousands or ruin his career forever. He would have to convince his superiors to try something radical, something that flew in the face of established military medical doctrine, and he would have to do it before more men died needlessly. The theory. Whitmore found Major Davidson in the surgical tent, his hands bloody to the elbows, his face a mask of concentration as he worked on a young private whose leg had been shattered by shrapnel. The boy couldn't have been more than 19, his face pale and sweating despite the cold November air. Without proper anesthetics, surgery had become a brutal affair of leather straps and whiskey. "Not now, Whitmore." Davidson grunted without looking up. Unless you miraculously conjured a shipment of morphine, I haven't time for your theories. Sir, I believe I know why our mortality rate is so high, even among men with survivable wounds. Whitmore's voice was steady, though his heart hammered in his chest. This was his moment, and he knew he would only get one chance to make his case. Davidson tied off the final suture and stepped back, nodding to the orderlies to remove the unconscious soldier. He stripped off his gloves and finally turned to face Whitmore, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and irritation. Go on then. Impress me. Whitmore spread his notebooks across the operating table, their pages covered in dense columns of numbers and observations. For 3 months, I've been tracking every patient who enters this hospital. Location, wound type, time to infection, survival rates, everything. The pattern is clear, sir. Men in certain areas of the hospital die at significantly higher rates than others, regardless of wound severity. Coincidence, Davidson said, but there was a flicker of interest in his eyes now. Or the more serious cases are placed in certain areas. I control for that, sir. I tracked identical wound types across different locations. A man with a leg wound in Tent C has a 40% higher chance of dying from infection than an identical case in 10A. The difference isn't the wound, it's the environment. Whitmore pointed to a crude map he had drawn of the hospital layout. Look at the pattern. The highest mortality is clustered around 3 areas, near the latrines, near the refuse pit, and the lowest lying ground where water accumulates. Davidson leaned forward, studying the map despite himself. Years of military medicine had taught him to trust statistics, even when they contradicted conventional wisdom. And your conclusion? Disease is spreading through contamination, sir. The miasma theory is wrong. It's not bad air that's killing our men. It's physical contact with contaminated materials. The orderlies working near the latrines touch patients without washing. Water pooling under tent seeps into bandages. Flies from the refused pit land on open wounds. We're spreading infection ourselves through poor sanitation. Whitmore, this is hardly revolutionary. Nightingale said the same thing 60 years ago at Scutari. Yes, sir, but we're not implementing her principles. We're too focused on treating wounds with medicines and surgery. But what if prevention is more powerful than cure? What if cleanliness itself is the medicine we need? Whitmore's voice grew more urgent. Sir, we have no antiseptics left. We have no morphine for pain, no chloroform for surgery. But we do have water. We have soap. We have the ability to isolate patients, to control the flow of people and materials through the hospital. If I'm right, these simple measures could save more lives than all the morphine and carbolic acid in Britain. Davidson was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving between the notebooks and the map. Finally, he spoke. You understand what you're proposing? You want me to reorganize the entire hospital around an improving theory at a time when we're already overwhelmed and undersupplied. If you're wrong, or if this disrupts our operations, men will die. I'll be court-martialed, and you'll be sent home in disgrace. And if I'm right, sir, we could revolutionize field medicine. Not just here, but across the entire front. Davidson rubbed his face with both hands, and in that moment, he looked everyone as 47 years. I must be mad, he said quietly, but I've watched too many boys die in the past 3 months from wounds that should have been survivable. If there's even a chance you're right. He looked up at Whitmore with red-rimmed eyes. You'll have your chance, Captain. But understand this. You will personally oversee every aspect of implementation. If this fails, it's your head, not mine. And you'll have 2 weeks to show results, or we return to standard procedures. Agreed? Agreed, sir. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Davidson said grimly. Now comes the hard part. You need to convince the nurses, the orderlies, and every other doctor in this hospital to completely change how they work. And you need to do it with no medicines, no supplies, and in the middle of the bloodiest offensive this war has seen. God help us both. The revolution. The next morning, Whitmore assembled the entire medical staff in the mess tent. Nurses stood alongside orderlies, surgeons next to stretcher-bearers, all of them exhausted, all of them skeptical. Major Davidson stood at the back, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. This was Whitmore's show now, for better or worse. "I know you're tired," Whitmore began, his voice carrying across the silent tent. "I know we're overwhelmed, undersupplied, and facing an impossible situation. But I'm going to ask you to do something even more difficult. I'm going to ask you to trust me and to completely change how we operate this hospital." A murmur ran through the crowd. Dr. Pembroke, a balding surgeon who had been working field hospitals since 1914, spoke up. "With respect, Captain, we've been doing military medicine for years. What makes you think a newcomer knows better?" "Because men are dying who shouldn't be dying," Whitmore replied bluntly. "Not from their wounds, but from what happens after. And I believe I know why." He unfurled his map and charts, explaining his observations about infection patterns and mortality rates. Some faces showed interest, others skepticism, but they all listened. "What I'm proposing is radical but simple," Whitmore continued. "We reorganize this hospital around one principle: separation and cleanliness. We divide patients into 3 zones: clean, contaminated, and isolation. Every person who enters must wash their hands with soap and water. Every instrument must be boiled before use. Every bandage changed twice daily. Every tent floor cleared of standing water. We relocate our latrines and refuse pits away from patient areas. And we enforce these rules absolutely with no exceptions." "That's madness," Dr. Pembroke protested. "We barely have time to treat the wounded now. You want us to spend hours washing and reorganizing? Men will die waiting for care. Men are already dying, doctor, at a rate of 30% from infection alone. If we can cut that in half, we'll save more lives than we lose from delayed treatment." Whitmore looked around the tent, meeting every eye. "I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to help me prove whether I'm right or wrong. Give me 2 weeks. If mortality doesn't drop, we go back to the old ways. But if it works, we could change how military medicine is practiced forever." Sister Margaret, the head nurse, a formidable woman in her 50s who had served in the Boer War, raised her hand. "What exactly do you need from us, Captain?" "Everything," Whitmore admitted. "The nurses will be critical. You'll need to enforce hand washing, oversee bandage changes, and monitor patients for signs of cross-contamination. The orderlies will need to restructure the entire camp, moving tents, relocating facilities, creating barriers between zones. The doctors will need to adapt their practices, prioritizing prevention as much as treatment." The discussion that followed was heated. Some supported the plan, others opposed it vehemently. But Davidson's backing proved decisive. "We try this," the major announced finally. "Captain Whitmore has overall authority for implementing these measures. You all have your orders." Dismissed. The next 48 hours were chaos. The entire hospital was reorganized from the ground up. The eastern tents, closest to contaminated areas, were torn down and relocated. New latrines were dug 100 yards away, downwind and downhill from patient areas. A system of washing stations was set up at every entrance, with strict orders that no one entered without cleaning their hands. Whitmore divided the patients into 3 categories. Clean cases, men with fresh wounds who had not yet developed infections, were kept in the westernmost tents, isolated from all others. Contaminated cases, men already showing signs of infection, were placed in the central area where they could be intensively monitored. Isolation cases, men with advanced infections or contagious diseases, were kept in separate tents with dedicated staff who did not interact with other patients. The resistance was fierce. Orderlies complained about the extra work. Some doctors insisted the measures were unnecessary superstition. Patients, delirious with pain and fever, resisted being moved. But Sister Margaret and her nurses proved to be Whitmore's greatest allies. They understood instinctively that cleanliness mattered. They had seen too many men die from infected wounds, too many surgeries fail, because of mysterious fevers that struck days after successful operations. On the 3rd day, a crisis tested the new system. A convoy of 40 severely wounded men arrived from the front lines, victims of failed assault on German positions. The surgical tents were overwhelmed, and the temptation was to abandon the new protocols in favor of speed. Dr. Pembroke argued loudly for exactly that approach. We're wasting time with all this washing and sorting. These men need surgery now. Whitmore stood firm. We follow the protocol. Every patient is assessed and placed in the appropriate zone. Every surgeon washes before operating. Every instrument is sterilized. If we abandon the system now, we'll never know if it works. The decision cost time, perhaps an hour of precious time while men bled and suffered. But they maintained the protocol. And as the days passed, something remarkable began to happen. The infection rate began to drop. The evidence, by the end of the first week, the change was undeniable. Whitmore stood in Major Davidson's office, spreading new charts across the desk. The numbers told a story that even the skeptics couldn't ignore. The infection rate had dropped from 30% to 21%. 9% might not sound dramatic, but in a field hospital treating hundreds of wounded men per week, it meant dozens of lives saved. "It's working," Davidson said quietly, studying the figures. His finger traced the declining mortality curve. "My God, Whitmore, it's actually working." "The clean zone has been the most successful," Whitmore explained, his voice betraying his excitement. "Men with fresh wounds, kept separate and treated with rigorous hygiene protocols, are showing infection rates of less than 8%. That's unheard of in field conditions, sir." But not everyone was convinced. Dr. Pembroke burst into the office without knocking, his face flushed with anger. "This is absurd, Major. I've just been told I cannot perform surgery because the boiling station hasn't processed my instruments yet. A man is dying while we wait for water to boil." "Which man?" Whitmore asked calmly. "Private Henderson, abdominal wound. Shrapnel still inside, causing internal bleeding. And if you operate with unsterilized instruments in his contaminated condition, he might get an infection," Pembroke snapped. "But he'll definitely die if I don't operate now." "Will he?" Whitmore pulled out another notebook. "I've been tracking similar cases. Men with abdominal wounds have a 70% mortality rate from post-surgical infection when operated on with standard field procedures. If Henderson survives the surgery, the odds are high that infection will kill him within 3 days. But if we stabilize him, get him to the rear hospitals where they have proper surgical facilities and supplies, he'll bleed to death before he gets there." Davidson held up his hand, silencing the argument. "How long until the instruments are ready, Whitmore?" 20 minutes, sir." "And Henderson's condition?" Whitmore had examined the private an hour ago. "Stable, pulse strong. I estimate he has several hours before the bleeding becomes critical." Davidson made his decision. "We wait. Pembroke, prepare for surgery. But you use sterilized instruments or you don't operate at all." "That's an order." Pembroke left, slamming the door behind him. Davidson sighed. "You're making enemies, Captain." "I know, sir, but I'm also saving lives." 25 minutes later, Pembroke performed the surgery with sterilized instruments. The operation was successful, and Private Henderson was placed in the clean zone for recovery. Whitmore personally oversaw his care, ensuring strict adherence to hygiene protocols. The private developed no infection and was transferred to a rear hospital 5 days later. Weak but alive, the word spread. Soldiers began requesting placement in the clean tents. Nurses reported that patients were voluntarily following hygiene rules, washing their own wounds when possible, refusing to let unclean visitors approach their beds. The culture of the hospital was changing from the bottom up, but the real breakthrough came with a simple experiment. Sister Margaret approached Whitmore with an observation. Men whose bandages were changed twice daily, with fresh boiled cloth and careful cleaning of the wound, showed dramatically lower infection rates than those changed once daily. Whitmore immediately instituted a study, dividing similar cases into 2 groups. The results were stunning. Twice daily bandage changes reduce infection by an additional 12%. "It's not just about cleanliness," Whitmore explained to an increasingly interested Major Davidson. "It's about consistency and thoroughness. Every time we touch a wound, we risk introducing contamination. But if we touch it properly, with clean hands and clean materials, we're actually removing contamination. The wound heals from the inside out, but only if we give a fighting chance." By the end of week 2, the mortality rate had dropped to 16%, nearly half the original rate. The hospital was saving an additional 40 lives per week, all without using a single new medicine. Davidson called another staff meeting, and this time the atmosphere was different. Even the skeptics had to admit something remarkable was happening. "Gentlemen and ladies," Davidson began, nodding to the nurses, "Captain Whitmore's protocols have exceeded every expectation. Our infection rate has been cut by nearly half. Our mortality rate is the lowest on the Western Front, and we've achieved this during one of the bloodiest periods of the war. I'm extending the trial indefinitely and recommending to headquarters that these protocols be implemented across all field hospitals." Dr. Pembroke stood slowly. The room fell silent, expecting another confrontation. Instead, he extended his hand to Whitmore. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I've been practicing military medicine for 3 years, and I've watched more men die from infection than from their wounds. If this can be prevented, if we can save even a fraction of those lives, then I'm with you, Captain. Tell me what you need." It was a turning point, but Whitmore knew the real challenges still lay ahead. The protocols worked in their hospital, but could they be scaled across an entire army? Would other doctors accept methods that contradicted decades of military medical tradition? And perhaps most importantly, would the authorities at headquarters support or suppress findings that implied the Army's medical practices had been needlessly killing thousands of soldiers? The opposition. The telegram arrived on a cold December morning. Major Davidson read it twice, his expression darkening with each word. He called Whitmore to his office immediately. "We have a problem," he said, handing over the message. "Headquarters is sending an inspection team. They want to investigate our irregularities." Whitmore felt his stomach drop. "They don't believe the results?" "Worse than that. They think we're falsifying our reports. Our mortality rate is so much lower than other field hospitals that someone's accused us of cooking the books to make ourselves look good." Davidson lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "The inspection team arrives in 3 days. They'll be led by Brigadier General Sir Marcus Thornberry, head of the Army Medical Services. If he decides we're running some kind of medical experiment without authorization, we'll both face court-martial." The news spread to the hospital like wildfire. The nurses were terrified. The orderlies talked of abandoning the protocols before the inspection. Even Dr. Pembroke suggested they tone down the more radical measures. But Whitmore refused to budge. "We've done nothing wrong," he insisted. "We've saved lives using methods that any medical school would approve. Let them inspect. Let them see the evidence." Sister Margaret organized the nurses like a general preparing for battle. Every record was meticulously reviewed. Every patient was interviewed about their care. Every tent was cleaned until it sparkled. If the Army Medical Services wanted to inspect their hospital, they would find it running better than any facility on the front. Brigadier General Thornberry arrived on a gray Thursday morning, accompanied by 3 senior medical officers and a clerk. He was a tall man in his 60s, with white mustaches and cold blue eyes that had seen 30 years of military service. He made his opinions clear from the first moment. "Gentlemen, I've reviewed your casualty reports, and they are, frankly, unbelievable. In my experience, when something seems too good to be true, it usually is. I'm here to determine whether incompetence or fraud explains these numbers." Davidson's face reddened, but Whitmore stepped forward calmly. "Sir, we welcome your investigation. We have nothing to hide. Our methods are simple, effective, and based on sound medical science. I'd be honored to explain them. I didn't ask for explanations, Captain. I asked for evidence." Thornberry turned to his team. "Begin the inspection. I want patient records, mortality logs, supply inventories. Talk to the staff individually. Find out what's really happening here." The inspection lasted 3 days. Thornberry's team interviewed patients, examined wounds, reviewed every document, and observed every procedure. Whitmore watched them work with growing anxiety. These were men who had decades of experience in military medicine. They represented the establishment, the traditional ways of doing things. Would they see the value in his methods, or would they view them as the dangerous innovations of an upstart? On the 3rd evening, Thornberry called a meeting in the command tent. Every doctor and senior nurse attended. The brigadier general stood at the front, his expression unreadable as he reviewed his notes. The silence was oppressive. Finally, he spoke. "Captain Whitmore, I came here expecting to find fraud or gross negligence. Instead, I find something far more disturbing." He paused, and Whitmore felt his career slipping away. "I find that a young doctor, barely 6 months out Edinburgh, has accomplished what the entire Army Medical Services has failed to achieve in 2 years of warfare. Your mortality rate is genuine. Your methods are sound. And frankly, that makes me furious." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Davidson stood. "Sir, I don't understand." "Don't you see?" Thornberry's voice rose. "If Whitmore is right, if simple hygiene and reorganization can cut mortality in half, that means we've been killing thousands of men through negligence and ignorance. It means every soldier who died from infection in the past 2 years died needlessly because we were too proud or too stupid to implement basic sanitation measures." His voice cracked with emotion. "My own son died at the Somme from gangrene after a leg wound, a survivable wound. He was 19 years old." The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Thornberry continued, his voice steadier now. "Captain Whitmore, your protocols will be implemented across all British field hospitals immediately. I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Service Order, and I'm assigning you to headquarters to oversee the implementation personally. Major Davidson, you'll be promoted to colonel and given command of medical services for the entire sector." Whitmore should have felt triumph, but all he felt was a crushing weight of responsibility. "Sir, how many men?" Thornberry knew exactly what he was asking. "Our casualty statistics suggest that approximately 25,000 British soldiers have died from infection-related complications since the beginning of the war. If your methods had been implemented from the start—" He didn't finish the sentence. "He didn't need to. Then we must ensure not one more dies needlessly." Whitmore said quietly, "Sir, implementing these protocols across the entire Army will require a massive training effort, a reorganization of supply lines, changes to field hospital design. We'll face resistance from doctors who have been doing things the same way for decades. It won't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever is, Captain, but we have one advantage now that we didn't have before. We have proof. Your hospital has demonstrated beyond any doubt that these methods work. Now we must convince the rest of the Army." The legacy. The implementation began in January 1917, and it was every bit as difficult as Whitmore had predicted. He traveled from hospital to hospital, training staff, overseeing reorganizations, and fighting against bureaucratic resistance at every level. Some doctors embraced the new methods immediately, grateful for any tool that might save lives. Others resisted furiously, viewing the protocols as an insult to their professional judgment. At a field hospital near Arras, a senior surgeon named Colonel Bancroft publicly refused to implement the washing stations. "I've been practicing medicine for 25 years, he declared. "I don't need some Edinburgh upstart telling me how to treat my patients." The confrontation came to a head when Bancroft's section reported an infection rate of 38%, while the rest of the hospital, following Whitmore's protocols, showed 12%. Thornberry, who had become Whitmore's strongest advocate, removed Bancroft from his position. The message was clear. The new protocols were not optional. Gradually, resistance crumbled as results became undeniable. Hospitals implementing the full protocol showed dramatic drops in mortality. Word spread among the soldiers themselves, who began demanding placement in hospitals known for cleanliness and low infection rates. By spring of 1917, the transformation was evident in the statistics. Army-wide infection-related mortality had dropped from 30% to 18%, with some hospitals achieving rates as low as 10%. The lives saved numbered in the thousands. Whitmore's methods were saving more soldiers than any weapon or strategy on the battlefield, but success came at a personal cost. Whitmore worked 18-hour days, traveling constantly and sleeping in different field hospitals every few nights. The endless confrontations with skeptical doctors, the bureaucratic battles, and the weight of knowing that every delay meant more deaths took their toll. Sister Margaret, who had been transferred to headquarters to help with the training program, found him one night in the records office, surrounded by mortality statistics, tears streaming down his face. "What's wrong?" she asked gently. "I'm looking at the numbers from 1915, he said hoarsely, "before we implemented the protocols. So many deaths. So many unnecessary deaths. If I had figured this out sooner, if I had spoken up earlier, if I had been more convincing—" "Stop," Margaret said firmly. She sat down beside him. "You saved thousands of lives, Captain. You changed how military medicine is practiced. You did more than any doctor has a right to hope for in a lifetime. You cannot torment yourself over the lives you couldn't save. Honor them by saving the lives you can." Her words helped, but the guilt never entirely left him. It drove him to work harder, to refine the protocols, to find new ways to reduce mortality. He began studying other preventable deaths: trench foot, frostbite, respiratory infections. Each one represented another opportunity to save lives through prevention rather than cure. In November 1918, when the armistice was signed, Whitmore stood in a field hospital in France, watching wounded German and British soldiers being treated side by side. The war was over, but his work had only begun. The protocols developed in desperation during the darkest days of the war had proven their worth. Now they needed to be implemented in civilian medicine, in peacetime hospitals, in medical schools around the world. Thornberry summoned him to London for a final meeting. The old brigadier general, soon to retire, looked exhausted but satisfied. "The final numbers are in, Whitmore. Your protocols saved an estimated 43,000 British lives during the final 2 years of the war. 43,000 men who went home to their families instead of dying in field hospitals. Do you understand what you've accomplished?" Whitmore nodded slowly. "And I understand what we failed to accomplish in the first 2 years. 25,000 deaths that could have been prevented." "Yes," Thornberry agreed. "And that knowledge will haunt both of us for the rest of our lives. But here's what you must understand. Medicine advances through the work of people who refuse to accept that that's how it's always been done is good enough. You were ignored, dismissed, and ridiculed, but you persisted. And because you did, tens of thousands of men lived who would have died. That is your legacy, Captain. Not the lives we couldn't save, but the lives we did." After the war, Whitmore returned to Scotland, but not to the teaching hospitals of Edinburgh. He went to the rural Highlands to serve the people who had no access to advanced medical care. He brought with him the lessons learned in the mud of Passchendaele, that cleanliness matters more than most medicines, that prevention is more powerful than cure, and that the simplest interventions often save the most lives. He trained local nurses in hygiene protocols. He established sanitation standards for the villages. He taught mothers about boiling water and washing hands. And he saved lives, just as he had saved lives in the war, though now it was children dying of preventable infections rather than soldiers dying of infected wounds. In 1952, at the age of 68, Dr. James Whitmore received a letter from the newly formed National Health Service. They wanted to interview him about his wartime experience with preventable hospital infections. The interview was conducted by a young doctor named Elizabeth Hartley, who had read his published papers with fascination. "Dr. Whitmore," she asked, "your work during the First World War anticipated many of the hygiene protocols we consider standard today. Yet at the time, you were largely ignored by the medical establishment. How did you keep going?" Whitmore smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I was never working for the establishment, Dr. Hartley. I was working for the soldiers in those tents, for the boys dying of infected wounds when they should have been going home to their mothers. When you work for the people who need you most, recognition from authorities becomes less important. But you must have felt vindicated when your methods were finally accepted?" "Vindicated?" Whitmore shook his head. "No, I felt grief. Grief for every life lost before we implemented the protocols. Grief for stubbornness of human institutions. Grief for how slowly we learn obvious truths. But I also felt hope, because every person who adopts these methods, every hospital that implements hygiene protocols, every doctor who chooses prevention over cure, saves lives. That's not vindication. That's redemption. Dr. Whitmore died in 1956, quietly, in his cottage in the Highlands. His obituary in the British Medical Journal was brief, mentioning his distinguished service order and his contributions to military medicine. But in field hospitals and civilian hospitals, in medical schools and public health departments around the world, his methods lived on, the protocols he developed in desperation, when he had no medicines and only his observations and determination became the foundation for modern infection control. Today, in every hospital where doctors wash their hands before treating patients, where instruments are sterilized, where patients are isolated to prevent cross-contamination, where cleanliness is recognized as a first line of defense against disease, the legacy of that ignored doctor lives on. He saved thousands during the war, but through the protocols he established, he has saved millions since. And that is how an ignored doctor, working without medicines in the mud of the Western Front, changed the practice of medicine forever.